Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap. I'm really excited about this one. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Automating for DevOps with Ansible. Our speaker today is Vinny Valdez, who is a senior principal consulting architect at Red Hat. Hey, Vinny, how you doing? Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Charlene. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Where's your red hat?
It's on the shelf.
Oh, okay, because normally I see, when the Red Hat folks come on, they have their hats with them. So just glad to hear you've got it. Okay, I know you've got a great webinar on tap. I'm going to go ahead and just put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and let you get to it.
Okay, great. So my name is Vinny Valdez. I've been at Red Hat I'm going on 14 years now. I focus mainly on infrastructure, virtualization, and other products on the infrastructure side, including automation. So I've been very focused on automation for the last few years. I'm based out of Michigan now. I just moved out here. And so let's jump right in. What we're going to talk about, a few things. We're going to talk about why would someone want to automate, and once you do decide that you do want to, where to get started. We'll talk a little bit about common pitfalls, and then kind of what to do next once you've kind of decided that this is the direction you want to go. So why automate? We commissioned a paper with Forrester late last year and into earlier this year, where they surveyed, we believe it was just shy of 400 different companies. And one of the key findings out of that paper was that 3 out of 5 of the correspondents are focused on automation as a top initiative over other competing goals, and it's been something that is very important across the majority of these organizations that we've talked to. And one of the things that we find as well is that leadership and the actual implementers themselves are misaligned on what goals and what specifically to focus on, which use cases, which can ultimately hinder success. We see that leaders are mainly focused on automating security management or responding to security threats, while implementers, these are the people close to the actual work itself, really concentrate on more like the provisioning and delivery of software, things that are very important and happen multiple times in their life and in their work. And so making that efficient and kind of focusing on these possibly manual or mundane tasks seem to be very important to the implementers. But these are obviously very important goals, and so we need to figure out what the best approach is in this area. And so another finding as we look across these respondents is 58% of the organizations are looking to automate or integrate different security solutions. And that was what we talked about from the leaders. Then the 57% are focused on the provisioning of the infrastructure itself and the delivery of software. So the provisioning itself can be any kind of maybe a virtualization provider or internal cloud provider, or even something out in public that you're using for whatever your software is. And so these are obviously very important for these organizations over the next 12 months, according to this paper. And so these are some of the reasons that we're finding, why people want to automate, why they want to start looking into it. Obviously, we want to reduce deployment time, reduce our provisioning time that we just talked about, and software delivery time, discovering bugs quicker and faster, and responding to them and patching and so forth. So this is DevOps itself, and these are extremely complementary to automation itself. So we talked a little bit about why we would want to automate. Where do we get started once we've decided that? So there are a few things we want to do. One of the first things is we want to understand what's needed, but we want to also prioritize that. So as we looked, we see that different people in different positions are going to have different priorities. So we really want to get a good understanding from people who are affected by these use cases that we're going to look at, and understand what is important, what the priorities are. Then we also want to document these. This is something we find customers do very little of. Document the use cases, what the success criteria would look like, but also what the process looks like itself. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but a lot of times people may have some sort of automation or maybe some half automation, half manual steps that are maybe documented internally. But a lot of times, if you kind of step back and look at how that's being achieved, a lot of times you can improve that just by understanding kind of the base underlying manual steps. And the last thing is, I mentioned already the use cases, but we really want to map these out in detail. We want to understand what the use cases are, what pieces they interact with, and what is being done now so that we can improve on that. Okay, so let's focus on the use case itself. One of the important things that I see, and one of the mistakes that kind of tends to creep up, and we may look at this as like scope creep, is understanding the difference between automating something that is happening now in your organization and then adding new functionality. So it's kind of natural when you think about it. If you want to improve something through automation, you're automatically going to realize some sort of benefit, and you're going to increase your efficiency. Ideally, you reduce human interaction and reduce errors and so forth. So it's kind of natural to say, hey, I'm already getting some benefits, so I want to do these extra things that I've been thinking about. But you want to be very careful about that. So make sure that you identify what you're doing now, and let's replicate that through some automation. And then once we can kind of sign off on that and understand and agree on how we're doing this, then we can add features. So I really want to make sure that we are matching really apples to apples on your use case. The next thing is determining a single source of truth. And what we mean by this is, if we talk specifically about something like Ansible, Ansible can use inventory sources from various places, including just a manual inventory that you write yourself, but it can take advantage of other CMDBs and other sources of data. So you want to understand, where that's coming from, and look at some sort of data model that your automation can use. So it's very important that you understand how your playbooks or whatever your automation is interacting with the source data that it's getting your machine inventory from. The other thing that's extremely important is separating your data from logic. So your inventory data should be completely separate, and as I mentioned, it may be coming from some other inventory source, but that should be version controlled. You could go as simple as creating your own inventory from the Ansible side. That would be YAML, of course, and then maybe having that version controlled in something like Git. That right there is going to be just multiple levels beyond what most people do. Just being able to manage your inventory that way. And then I'll get into a bit later about how that can give you some additional advantages in kind of separating your data from the inventory itself from the actual automation logic. The other thing would be, once you have at least established some sort of inventory data source, then you can start developing different workflows. And these workflows may share that same data structure. So a very simple example could be if you want to provision some bare metal and you want to install some software on it. Well, there's a lot of other stuff that has to happen. Maybe the network has to be configured to support whatever the use case is going to be, whatever the software will be on top of that bare metal. So you're going to have to configure the switches, the BIOS. Maybe it's a new server, maybe it's an old server that's being recommissioned from some different use. You don't know, what the RAID may be configured as. All of that can be automated. All of that can be set up in sequential workflows where it configures maybe the network ports for the server first, then moves on to a workflow that works on the bare metal itself in terms of BIOS. Maybe you're updating, the manager like an ILO or a DRAC. Then you can do some other automation via Redfish to configure RAID and other things like that. So all of these could share from a single source of truth for your inventory, and be able to create all these workflows and various different automation that's going to use the same data. And I mentioned this a little bit, but something else extremely important is isolating your logic for your automation and your data. So a very simple example might be if you have a playbook and it's just installing some packages. I think anybody who's done any kind of automation would probably run into a very simple use case like that. Let's say I want to install package ABC. So you could write a playbook as an example for Ansible, and you can tell it to install package ABC, packages ABC. And then let's say something happens down the line, you're using this playbook, maybe some other organization, another team is using the same playbook. And then maybe a use case could happen where you don't need package A anymore. You just need B and C. So you would go edit the playbook and take out that package A. Well, now you're affecting another team who's using your playbook, and maybe they did need package A. And so then you start causing a bit of conflict there, in addition to the fact that you had to make code changes. Conversely, if you were to keep that in an inventory set of information, so your package ABC could be defined in your inventory for your team's use case, you would not have to change that playbook. It would install package variable name. Variable name would come from the inventory. Then this team 2 would have their own inventory, and they wouldn't be affected by any changes that you make to your own inventory. Just a simple example, but along the way, there's other advantages, such as being able to share your playbooks, even publicly or with other teams, that you don't have to worry about them being exposed to any of your data for your environment. Okay, so talked about the workflow a bit for what you're trying to automate, but want to stress again, let's document how it's being achieved today. So there's many improvements that can be made. Let's make those incremental additional features that we add along the way. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you understand what the process is today. It could be a mix of manual, maybe a little bit of scripting, or maybe some other automation. Let's map that out completely. A lot of times, there may be a bash script that accomplishes what you need. For example, you technically could open up a bash script in something like VI, Vim, or some other editor, and you could transform that into a YAML Ansible playbook where it's just calling commands out. That's not very efficient, though. That's not going to scale very well. It's not really taking advantage of Ansible and the modules that are provided. So rather than doing something like that, map out what the steps are. How would you do this manually today? A lot of times when you bring in other consultants or architects to look at these workflows, as you work through them, you may find that there may be some improvements you can make that weren't obvious before. And the other thing is just breaking things down into small consumable chunks. So many of these workflows can get very, very complex, and just make sure that once you map it out, it'll allow you to kind of look at natural chunks of pieces of work that you can do. So we'll talk a little bit about some common pitfalls I've seen with customers. One of the main things I want to call out is a lack of CI/CD. So when we work with customers, a lot of times, there's going to be ultimately people want to put things into production. But before they do that, a lot of times they want to start with the POC, make sure that it meets their needs, make sure that their use case makes sense. And what typically happens in a POC type environment is you have very limited hardware. And that naturally will make it difficult to set up an entire CI/CD type environment. But I stress that this is extremely important, because as you go through engagements and you start developing code and you want to test it, a CI/CD type of workflow will allow you to push a change, for example, to Git, and have that fire off a hook that will then run your entire deployment. And then you'll immediately be able to see any sort of issues that you may encounter. Conversely, I've definitely been a part of long-term engagements where the equipment was very limited. We didn't have CI/CD in the scope. We didn't have hardware to do that. And so we waited until major pieces of development were done to then go test it end to end. And when you do that, you will, I hate saying that, but you will encounter issues that you didn't think of. Maybe somebody changed a variable name, made some sort of improvement, and it's going to affect something upstream that you didn't realize. And trying to work through those issues, during this end-to-end deployment is really going to be time consuming. Back again to mixing data and logic, talked about that a bit, gave some examples on how that can affect others. But I will stress that, I've worked with customers where getting access to their environment was very difficult. And so we were able to share playbooks via something like a public Git type repo, but have our own private inventory repos that we didn't share with each other, but be able to push changes and share and merge changes on the playbook repository, where the inventory was separate and private. So that's another kind of really good use case for separating your data and logic. Something else we see is not having standards. So not having coding standards or approval standards or security standards. Not having those is something that can definitely lead to issues later on. So having approvals in a workflow are very important, and definitely part of a lot of customers' workflows. But there are maybe some cases where you're just doing some simple development and testing where you maybe there's a certain threshold where underneath that threshold you may not need an approval. Maybe a certain number of CPUs or VMs for provisioning of some infrastructure. And the other thing is access to other teams that are affected. So, working with customers where they need some network changes or some other changes that require a different department, and just looking at the time it takes to file a ticket, waiting for a response, and so forth. One of the things that we think is important when you put together an initiative around an automation, you really want to get members from all these various teams to be involved in some sort of working group so that they're aware of the initiatives and who to contact when you need changes to be made. This sounds simple, but it is really important. When you're getting started, start small, get an early win. And this kind of goes back to talking about the complexity of workflows. You really want to, if you're just getting started with automation, look at some things like, creating simple automation jobs that just read or do check only. Now, it's not going to make a lot of changes. It's not going to do a lot for you, but it will get you comfortable with automation. And we're talking about Ansible, getting used to writing YAML and making sure that you have your two spaces everywhere properly, and just getting a feel for the workflow and the automation itself, and SSH key exchange and some of the basics that you need to get in place for automation to work. Once you can kind of get past the read-only and the check jobs, then move on to more simple jobs. We talked earlier about the implementers focusing on provisioning of infrastructure and software. That's a really great step to start, because when we work with customers, especially in DevOps, we see this is a common use case. You have to provision something to be able to host the software. Once you move on, start iterating, testing frequently, look at CI/CD, and just be able to test all of your changes end to end. Okay, so we talked a bit about why and kind of how to get started. So once you've decided that this is really for you, what comes next? So we'll talk about, in services, we have an offering called the Automation Adoption Journey. And what we do is we look at your overall organizational maturity from an automation standpoint. So here we're just looking at a very simple scale that shows on the left, we have level 1 from an automation maturity standpoint. So this is where you're aware of automation. There may be some scripting or some minor things. In fact, another slide here goes into a little bit more detail. But all the way to the right is where you're just fully self-optimized, self-healing, and you really are completely mature. And so what we want to do is find out where you and your organization are on this maturity scale, and that will help drive and inform the way that we plan the rest of the engagement for you. If you're already extremely mature, that will help us jump right into some of the more advanced features of what you want to get done through automation. Versus, or if you're just getting started, then we'll have a different set of focus. And so this slide here just goes into a little bit more detail about what I talked about. So again, we want to understand where you are, and then also agree where we want to get you to. Not everybody wants to get to fully optimized, in one engagement. Kind of going back to small steps and kind of breaking things down into simpler chunks and incrementing. So we certainly can get you along the way, a step at a time. Just depends on where you are now. Okay, so other things that we look at is what it takes to transform your organization, not just from pure technical standpoint, but also how to make sure that the right people are accountable for different governance and standards. And that kind of goes back to what we talked earlier about having different standards. Who's responsible for various pieces of the automation, security, compliance, and all that sort of stuff. How to scale out. And again, there's been automation for years and years, right? But really what it comes down to is how to scale it. That's very important to many organizations. Just automating things is one effort, but making sure that it can scale properly throughout your environment is extremely important. So we talked a bit about what to do, what customers are looking to do, and a bit about why. What Red Hat can do for you, and services specifically, is bridge that gap. Help you get to where you need to be and where you want to be with automation, and making sure that you're doing that in a way that uses best practices, using our expertise, and just helping you accelerate your adoption so that you can see value for the effort that you put in your work. So I'll talk a little bit more about the automation adoption journey. So this is a very custom but very structured engagement that we have put together a lot of frameworks for, depending on, as I mentioned, where you are on the automation maturity scale. But what we want to do is understand, what the strategy is overall, where you're trying to get to, where your organization is now, and how to get there, and what it would take to adopt automation properly throughout your entire environment. So not just technology, right? We've kind of focused on that a little bit in some of the examples and my so far what I've talked about. But there's also processes, there's also culture, there's a lot more than just the technology, and that's kind of what this journey focuses on. Obviously, there will be technology, and we will focus on sprints and increments and how to get you there. But we want to make sure that we focus on everything. So this means not just use case documentation, as I mentioned, documenting exactly how you get things done. This will be useful for your organization in the future. Maybe you move on to some other kind of automation or something else where you need to audit or evaluate various processes. You will now have them documented through our assistants. The other thing that we want to focus on through this journey is, as I mentioned, breaking things into smaller chunks, things that are consumable, things that we can plan through sprints, and we can see value much quicker and expand on those and add features as we get through those. And the last piece is cultural transformation. I mean, this is going to be massive. Just simple examples of, I mentioned a few times bash scripts, and I say that because that's where I see a lot of customers coming from, customers who want to move on to more scalable and more enterprise-wide automation. But things like bash scripts can get the job done, they're great. But that means that whoever runs them may need to have, likely have sudo or root access to the servers. Whereas something with Ansible, you can use, especially with Ansible Tower, and I can talk a bit more about that later if anyone has questions, but that will allow you to set up RBAC controls so that you can set up workflows that will take advantage of credentials that you have securely encrypted and saved, and giving access to teams or individuals that don't necessarily have sudo or root access to those servers, as an example. Okay, so with Red Hat Services, we have essentially an iterative model, and this is how we can help you harness your value at scale. So not just defining the strategy and establishing the initial capabilities and being able to kind of pilot or POC your capabilities, but launching the entire ecosystem of automation and understanding how that affects everybody, every team, everybody in your organization, and being able to innovate and scale that out. That's really, really the key is understanding how to scale that to worldwide, different locations throughout your organization. So this here is a quick glance at the framework I talked about. So the automation adoption journey, this is our map. So we start with, we break these into what we call increments. So we start with increment 0, which is navigate. So this is really where we come in and we're trying to establish our overall strategy. So we want to understand, at an early stage, what gaps there are from a skills perspective, or how we can establish, where we want to get to and how to measure those outcomes. Then we move on to the foundation increment. This is where we are going to work with you and your team and just try to establish a cross-functional team for establishing our pilot. And this is where we're going to dive into your use cases. So we're going to put together a set of use cases and workflows where we understand what the focus of the rest of the engagement is going to be. And then as we move on to the additional increments here, these are going to be really custom lengths depending on what your organization needs, where you're at maturity-wise from an automation perspective, and where you need to go. So this is a bit of kind of guideposts for what we're going to accomplish in these increments, but these will definitely be a bit longer than the initial, navigate and foundation pieces. So Red Hat Services, we have a quote here from the president of SoftBank talking about how we've helped them with their use cases. And so, we're here to help you whatever level of help you need. The journey is obviously going to be something that we want to help you with, because it's going to help not just drive your automation, your technical change that you need, but also the cultural change. But we have various levels of offerings if whatever it is that you need, we are here to help you. I'd also like to point out that we have a DevOps checklist you can download. The URL is here. I believe we're going to send this deck out so everyone will have the ability to click on this as well. But I'll leave it up for just a second in case anybody wants to download this. But you could also visit our consulting website. There's a link at the bottom to set up time to talk with somebody here at Red Hat about what your goals are and what you need. Okay, so that concludes the presentation section. I think now I can take any questions.
Yeah, so we've had some questions come in, but there's plenty of time, guys. If you have a question for Vinny, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And just also real quick, if you do submit a question and we don't get to it during the presentation, Vinny will be getting a copy of all the questions that come in. So I'm sure he or somebody from Red Hat will be more than happy to follow up with you offline. But let's go ahead and dive into the ones we've gotten so far. Here's the first one for you. Can you please recommend a good configuration management system?
Absolutely. So I mentioned Ansible a couple of times. I was trying to be a little bit higher level and kind of just mention automation in general. Obviously, we here at Red Hat, we're very focused on Ansible from an automation perspective. There are definitely a lot out there, but I would say, even before we acquired Ansible, the company, Ansible was something that I absolutely fell in love with. The pure simplicity of YAML and not really having to learn a programming language necessarily. For me, combined with the agentless approach for Ansible, really, it's for me, it was just a no-brainer. And you probably heard me mention bash scripts quite a bit. That really is what I've done for the most of my career is just bash, bash, bash. But now, when I find even a small task that I want to accomplish, even if it's something I want to do just one time, I go straight to Ansible. So that's what I would recommend. It's baked in to many of our products now, as the installer for some of our products, like for example, our Red Hat virtualization product, our Red Hat satellite product, things like that. They all use Ansible underneath to lay down configuration and install. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, great. Next question here. Can you please speak to some of the benefits of Tower versus Ansible alone? Tower licenses are expensive and a hard sell for my company.
Totally understand. So what I would say from a cost perspective, first of all, we have trial licenses, which you could also request. But there's also an upstream project called AWX, and we have, that is the open source version of Tower. Of course, you get no support or anything that way, but that's one way to get started. But just talking about the differences, so sure, everything that you can do from a playbook or an automation perspective from Tower, you can also do through just pure Ansible CLI. Tower does bring some additional features. I mentioned earlier RBAC, so being able to define different users who can access different workflows, building different workflows and different, they're called job templates, but basically pointing to a playbook, and making those available to other people via, we have a feature called surveys. So surveys allow you to define UI elements. So you could have drop downs, you could have a simple example I can think of, maybe you want to update firmware on a BIOS or something, and you want to delegate that to another team. And as an example, you want them to reboot now or maybe reboot later. You can have that available in like a survey that kind of provides variable data. Other than that, you can separate things into different organizations, different teams. There's a lot of management and features that Tower does provide you. And as I mentioned, you can get a trial or look at the upstream project if you're curious. But Tower itself also has an API. So Tower itself can be installed and configured as code, which is interesting. So we have, our consulting teams have worked very hard to put out a collection right now that manages Ansible Tower and allows you to just simply manage it in Git. And so you can use Tower to deploy, Ansible to deploy Tower and manage it that way as well.
Excellent. Okay. Excuse me. Plenty of time, guys. If you have a question for Vinny, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. Here's another one that's come in. In the absence of a coherent automation strategy, is it worthwhile to stop practitioners from creating ad hoc tools, Ansible playbooks, Python scripts, one-off shell pipelines?
I mean, I would say sometimes it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation, right? If you don't have any proof that the automation or the technology can give you what you want, then it's sometimes hard to convince management to have a coherent strategy. So I would say, don't be discouraged from that if you don't have an official strategy from management to support something like it, playbooks or Ansible, but certainly will make your life easier. So that's something that I've seen a lot of customers do. A lot of kind of, I wouldn't call it necessarily under the table, but sort of, it's going to improve your life anyway. So doing that without approval, of course, make sure it's not affecting your job negatively, but in most cases, it's going to help you and make you more efficient, right? So once you can show that value to management, hopefully that will lead to a better strategy.
Okay. All right, great. I think we have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions here. Let's see, any standards for governance or recommended approval structures?
We do have some recommendations within our automation journey. So I would say, if you're curious about how we can help you establish some standards, give us a call, contact us, and we can help you through that. There's not really something I can point to now off the top of my head, but we definitely have the structure for it.
All right, let's see. Okay, next question. With your experience, With your experience, how scalability affect automating an environment which scope keeps changing? Okay, let me see if I can figure this one out. With your experience, how scalability, well, I'm not sure that I can figure this one out.
I think I understand the gist there.
Okay, good. Good.
And really, the question seems to be about scope creep, and that happens all the time. And I talked a little bit about that. I would say just having well-defined goals, right? So your use cases, and like I mentioned earlier, if we can really define the use case, the steps to achieve what you're trying to, whatever your goal is, but also understanding, how this is going to be scaled is another extremely important point. But just keeping that scope limited and making sure that you are accomplishing that within some sort of increment, maybe a sprint or however you want to call it, and then making sure that you identify, features. And I will say, in most of my engagements, we're going to use some sort of code repository, whether it's GitHub or GitLab, Bitbucket, something like that. And usually those repository management software has some sort of issue tracker. And so that's what we do. It's very easy to say, hey, I accomplished X as I was going to, but then I realized if I would have just done a little bit of Y, this would really help. And almost unanimously, we decide file an issue, and we'll prioritize that, and we'll get to that. Because it's easy to just go off the rails, like you mentioned about scope creep, and just, oh, but this would be so much better if, and then you look up 3 days later and realize, the sprint's about to end. So yeah.
Okay. All right, guys. I think we have time for one more question, then we'll have to close out the question and answer period. Okay, from one of your slides, it indicates that as your automation maturity grows, the effort required for changes goes down. What's the best way to get through that resource bubble that is needed while the organization matures?
Yeah, so I would say, hate to sound like a broken record, but small wins is really going to be what it is when you have smaller successes, those start to accumulate and start to build confidence, especially in leadership. So that's really the only way we recommend is just define your work, approach it in an incremental fashion, and show success early, show early wins, and just continue to increment. That's the best advice I can give.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for the question and answer period. I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. And as I said before, if we didn't get to your question, I apologize. But please note that the folks at Red Hat will be getting a copy of all the questions that came in, and we'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Also, a quick reminder that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand, and the webinar will also be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Vinny, thank you so much for a great presentation today. Lots of great information. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.